Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the General Eclectic Podcast with Rod Dreher. I'm your host, Kale Zeldin, and we were here with a very special guest today, Mary Harrington. But before I bring Mary in, I just want to say, Rod, what's going on over there in Baton Rouge?
You know, I just watched the Eric Zemmour campaign launch video, which is just one of the, whatever you think of Zemmour, this is an incredible piece of political rhetoric. And I think that this is something we're going to be talking about for a while. But let's let our listeners see it. It hasn't been subtitled in English. I just put it on my blog with a translation. But the thing that occurs to me is, who would have guessed that it would take an Algerian-born French Jew to out Le Pen. It's an amazing. Anyway, but we're here to talk about something else.
Well, not entirely. I think we can probably make some sort of connections. But with us today is someone that I've been following, I guess, for about a year now, Mary Harrington. Mary, you write at Unherd, is that correct?
That's right. I'm contributing editor at Unherd.
Contributing editor at Unherd.
A UK politics and current affairs magazine online.
Yeah, and she has a Substack, like I guess everybody but me. But at any rate, I find her a fascinating writer and thinker, and I think you would too. But you, Mary, wrote a piece, well, two things about NatCon 2, which is where I think we want to start off here. You gave a speech that I'd like to talk to you about, but you also wrote a sort of almost a kind of Hunter S. Thompson type piece of being like in the wild amongst conservative ink and conservative ink.
Gorillas in the mist. Conservatives in the mist.
It was really quite something. And I kind of use it in my own head as a kind of counterpoint to David Brooks's version of that. I'm not sure if you saw that write-up that he did. So at any rate, how did you get to NatCon 2 and what did you hope to do there and what did you see?
Yeah, Mary, are you a conservative?
Right.
There's a very long answer to that question, which I think will probably take up most of this podcast. So I'll spare you the answer to that. The very short answer is yes and no. How did I get to NatCon 2? Well, I started writing kind of by accident in late 2019. I was a stay-at-home mum at the time, and I found myself with a little more time and took up and resumed a political blog, which I'd sort of left fallow for a few years, just because I've always enjoyed writing, and I found myself thinking a lot about politics while vacuuming the stairs. So I picked that up, and then I thought, well, why not? So I pitched a couple of pieces to digital publications and was approached by Unherd in late 2019. I think I published my first piece there, which was an attack on conservatism it was an attack on economic growth from the right.
Right.
Which I suppose put me somewhere near what, with hindsight, was the cutting edge of the sort of post-liberal strain of conservatism, which is emerging now.
Yeah, the sort of the worship of growth and all of that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But at the time I was reading Tim Jackson, Prosperity Without Growth. I mean, he comes very firmly from the tradition of the left, but his critique of economic growth and the ecological impacts of that intersected with my observations of the effects of the hollowing social effects of growth and growthism and all of its ancillaries, just in the microcosm of small town life as a stay-at-home mum. It's a social desert. If you're at home with your kids past the usual point where people go back to work after maternity leave, civil society is mostly run by a few superannuated 70-year-olds, because there are no mums coming through who are the ones who always used to get things done. There are plenty of different ways there are plenty of different lenses you can bring to that, but I suppose that sort of came together for me into a critique that was neither left nor right. So I suppose there's the answer to your question, Rod. Am I a conservative? Yes and no. Anyway, so I wrote that, and I think I've, apart from holidays, I've pretty much written for them every week since. It just turned out it was a good fit, as they say.
Yeah.
And I guess a couple of years later, I mean, NatCon was a complete surprise. I was immensely honoured to be invited by Yoram to participate.
Yoram Hazony, she means. He's the founder, Israeli academic who's the founder of NatCon.
Yeah, I was surprised and very honoured to be invited out to Florida to join really quite an eclectic and interesting gathering of American conservatives to talk about, well, everything really. The talk I gave I titled Trads, Cads and RadFems, and really it was an argument. The core of my argument is that feminism is, to a significant extent, the story of economic transitions. And what we understand as feminism emerged with the industrial era in response to the ways industrialization disrupted sex relations between the sexes at the level of family life, and that all those relations are up in the air again, and we find ourselves arguing interminably about men and women and whether or not such things even exist, because we're in the middle of another economic transition out of the industrial era and into something I suppose we could call the digital one. This intersects with a whole slew of other interests of mine. But that's really the core of my argument. I characterized, three typical responses to the difficulties we find ourselves in as a consequence of that disruption, which I characterized as trads, who say we should put it all back in the box, and then the cads who say, well, we should just go for a zero-sum pursuit of pleasure, and then the radfems who seek the final victory of one sex over the other. And my argument is that actually all of those are disastrous in different ways, and we need to find a new form of solidarity between the sexes. I mean, at that point I ran out of time, so although I have some more concrete policy suggestions in the oven, as it were, for how I think what shape that might take. I got as far. It took me 15 minutes to make the argument, so that's about brings us up to now.
What just quickly? What kind of feedback did you get? What kind of reaction did you get for this? This is RadFems and Cads. Trads, Cads, and RadFems. What kind of feedback did you get? I mean, did you think people sort of bought it? Do you think was it helpful for people?
I got incredibly positive feedback, actually, including I was expecting a pitchfork waving mob of my radical feminist friends to be there, with flaming torches at Heathrow when I got back. But actually, the response I got from my friends on the feminist left was more along the lines of this is interesting, and I disagree with at least half of it, but it's still interesting.
That's good. That's good.
In my work, I suppose I'm trying to thread the needle between making a case for women's political interests, which I believe needs to be made, and some of the critiques of liberal feminism, including the ones I make myself, which is a field of thought that I think has some uncounted costs, which are adding up to something of a reckoning.
Yeah, it really speaks your idea of talking about costs is, I think, a potent one, and I think ultimately a compelling one, at least for me, especially as you sort of tie that to your atheism of progress. I think you quipped in another space, that you do not believe in progress the way that it is sort of typically believed in, and it seems to be an article of faith for many people. I'm curious because I can mark my own sort of intellectual development. In fact, I even know the precise moment in which it hit me across the face, when I had to reckon with the fact, as I saw it, as I see it, that progress is an illusion. How did that happen for you?
I don't know that I could pinpoint it exactly, but probably my best guess is that it was somewhere around 2008, where a number of things imploded for me simultaneously. One of them was a very idealistic web startup project that I co-founded, which I suppose was an example. It was an attempt at the sort of third way kind of socially engaged capitalism that was all the rage in the noughties. If you like, the forerunner of the woke capitalism we have now. Yeah. And so that I came to with all manner of high-flown ideals, and through considerable fault of mine, amongst others, it all came to an end. Simultaneously, the supposedly endless era of no more boom and bust came to an end in the financial crash, and also the house I was living in, which was in its way a kind of idealistic communitarian experiment, also imploded. So all those three things collapsed at once. Right. And I suppose that was, and simultaneously I hit roughly the sort of quarter life crisis point. Right. and all of those, but by the time I'd recovered from all of that, I suppose I was about 35, and I'd taken out and fairly thoroughly critically examined a lot of the beliefs that I had in my 20s, including the foundational one that progress is self-evidently a thing.
Where does that come from? I mean, because for me, I grew up, in a very normal, bougie, middle-class American world. I sort of had this implicit belief in progress that, by the fact that I was, this was 1991, and, because it comes after 1961, 1991 was just better. Technology was better. The world was getting better. I had sort of deeply internalized that idea. And for me, it was an encounter with art, in specifically literature, that blew up my religious faith in progress. And then that just unraveled everything for me. As soon as you sort of let that brick, you take that cornerstone off, everything for me just sort of fell apart radically.
Well, I think too that once you see that what is called progress is actually a very narrowly defined sense of what is good that suits a particular sort of person in your society. When you realize that progress for one is regress for others, that's when I believe you start questioning it.
Absolutely.
And Mary, you hit this pretty hard when it comes to various waves and sorts of feminism. I notice these things that are done, quote unquote, in the name of women, really seem to be helping a certain class of women.
Absolutely, and that's not a critique which is unique even to the right.
Right. Correct.
The 2009 anti-capitalist feminist book, written by three, I'm afraid the author's names escape me just now, but one of them is Nancy Fraser. It's a well-regarded anti-capitalist feminist manifesto called Feminism for the 99%, which has an absolutely stinging, and I think for the most part extremely accurate critique of liberal feminism, which it characterizes not as liberal feminism but corporate feminism.
Wow.
And argues that in order to lean in, these upper middle class bougie women in the developed world must lean on a whole stratum of invisible and deliberately erased lower class, often women of color, who perform all of the tasks that they've been quote unquote liberated from, in order to smash the glass ceiling or whatever.
Right.
And this is a well understood critique on the anti-capitalist left. So this is by no means just a right-wing thing. I mean, what you do with that insight, I suppose, defines where you might situate yourself on the political spectrum. But it's I find it I find it a compelling argument.
I think that J.D. Vance said it at NatCon that the culture war is class war in other terms. And once you accept that, a lot of things become clear. I mean, what do you think about that?
I think that's right. In fact, I had dinner the other day with a young woman, a Cambridge undergraduate, who comes from a relatively lower middle class background in a relatively down at heel English seaside town, who has been who despite being a theatre kid of decades standing by the time she began undergrad, has been pretty much cancelled by her entire sort of theatre community at her university, effectively because her personality just doesn't fit. It's that there have been various grounds have been given about, well, she's supposedly making people feel unsafe, but when she pushed them for what the actual reasons were, for it just boiled down to, we don't like your personality. I put it to her that that most of these kids come from privileged backgrounds, and does she think that there's an aspect of class war to it? And she said, yeah, absolutely. In order, if you come from those backgrounds, you're fluent in this idiom, and you're fluent in using this idiom to expel people that you dislike from the communities that you want to be, that you want to excel in. And it's absolutely, it's very effectively used as a weapon by people who are skilled in operating that register.
Yeah, and I've heard, so I think it was Eric Weinstein say something like, from the left, that labor is more expensive than identity, and so that identity becomes the sort of the engine that's a little bit more capturable on some level, and because you don't have to worry about class. What it becomes now. So, but in the NatCon piece, you talk about these three what you consider kind of non-starters: a trad response, a cad response, and a radfem response. Can you just, for our audience, sort of just do a quick recap to what do you see about those responses that are not up to it?
Well, I suppose I have to take them one at a time. So, I mean, I'm being hopelessly reductive here, and all kinds of people. I'll invite anybody who wants to throw brickbats at me afterwards for all the ways in which I'm going to have to be hopelessly reductive here. But as I see it, the trad response says roughly, correctly identifies the sexual revolution as a central disruptive force in the social fabric, and as a source of a number of costs which we perhaps are not fully counting at present. This stance argues that if only we could just put the sexual revolution back in its box and return to traditional sex roles, man goes out to work and woman stays at home, then everything will just be hunky-dory and all of these problems will go away. To which I say, it sounds good. That's all very well, but even if we could do this, the economic conditions in which a man goes out to work and woman stays at home obtained in the first place no longer obtain. We no longer live in an industrial society. Increasing amount of work is done remotely. Work is not sufficiently well paid. I mean, this has been a recurring topic, I believe, for politicians and for American conservative politicians. The fact that it's no longer possible to survive on one income, and it has not been for some time for the majority. And so to the trads, I've been saying, this is all very well, but it's structurally an elite argument now. For the millennial kids who are scratching to make rent, even with two of them, even with two of them rooming together in a shared house. How are you seriously going to propose that they have a breadwinner homemaker set up? How do you get there from there? It just doesn't work. So the trad thing sounds great, but it sort of hits the brick wall of actually existing economic fabric pretty hard.
Well, can I jump in there, Mary, for a second? I imagine most of our listeners would fall in the trad category. I was just talking yesterday to a Catholic politics professor I know, and he said he would call himself a trad, I suppose, but he said exactly what you're saying. That hold on,
is that Roscoe?
Yeah,
I tell you what,
let me beat the dog. I'm sorry.
It's all right. Go ahead.
I think he's gone away.
All right.
Okay, the squirrel has passed. Mary, my friend said that too many people on our side, he's talking about conservative, Catholic, Christian, whatever, have no material consciousness, no consciousness of the way the material factors play into this dynamic that we're criticizing. And so we end up being hopelessly idealistic. And that sounds like what you're saying.
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly it. That's pretty much exactly it. It's, again, I'm stealing quotes again from the left, but some of these guys need to check their privilege.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. As for the Cads.
Yeah. Because that's most, right? Wouldn't you say that most folks fall into the Cad
I don't
category?
know. I mean, I'm actually addressing both sexes, although I think that the Cad worldview plays out in different ways.
And the costs are different, as you would say.
And the costs are different. This is really the idea that we can and should apply a transactional model to sex relations and just seek to get the optimize in a transactional way what we can get out of the opposite sex. Whether that's a high earning or depending on what sex you are, either an extremely well paid or and high status, or an extremely beautiful partner.
Sure.
Or, you know, or as much sexual gratification as we'd like.
Mm-hmm.
That we should treat our relationship potential really as a source of personal or even financial leverage. Right. And that plays out for both sexes differently. You know, it turns into, you know, for women it looks like classes in you know, freshman classes in how to set up your OnlyFans, right. You know, and work as a cam girl whilst you know, while studying at university.
While you can, right, yeah.
Right. Well, while you can, exactly. There was a scandal recently in the UK about, I think it was Durham University, or one of the, you know, really quite respectable universities running freshman courses in how to safely engage in sex work. And here we're not just talking about, you know, working as a cam girl, but actually escorting.
Yeah, sure.
You know, once upon a time for young women, the idea was that if you're going to college would get you as far away as possible from ever having to embark on sex work, but you know, it seems that's not really where we are anymore.
What a strange reconvergence of commodification.
Progress.
Indeed, progress. So and on the male side, it just looks like a sort of brutally, you know, all the men's rights and pickup artist conversations about, you know, optimizing your sexual market value, you know, getting the most physically attractive pussy that you possibly can.
That's right. That's right.
You know, really, and I think there are a number of conversations sort of broadly within the umbrella of the online right, who are fully signed up to the CAD perspective and really see women as not fully people, but more sort of things, you know, who can be, you know, that can be rated, ranked, exploited, you know, enjoyed, you know, in a sort of gamified view of life in which only really men are human.
Yeah, it sort of makes it a sort of it sort of falls into a strange sort of stereotype or caricature of itself, you know, a caricature of masculinity in the, you know, and you see the memes for these sorts of things with the Chads and I think you've joked about, you know, the raw egg, you know, the raw egg, right, or something like that.
Well, I mean, look, it's the repaganization of sexual relations, and I'm referring to the pre-Christian Greco-Romans, you know, where men had they had all the authority and they could do whatever they wanted and use women to whom they weren't married and use male slaves as sexual toys. And I mean, and we're going back there very quickly.
Right. And I suppose, and my argument really is that in as much as that reproduces this sort of transactional atomistic understanding of what people are, it is, as I put it on a really very different live stream to this the other day, shit libbery with extra steps. You know, it's just. You
should be a writer, Mary. I tell you, boy, you've got it. You've got it, sister.
So that's really. I mean, the Cads come in both flavors. You know, they come in male and female flavor, and increasingly all manner of flavors in between. God help us.
Right.
But in as much as it reproduces the transactional view of what humans are, it's shit libbery with extra steps. Yep. So I don't even think of it. You know, I don't even think of it as, you know, it's a conservative like phenomenon, but it's I don't even really classify it in that category.
Yeah.
As for the RadFems, I mean, I think that's really about the supremacy of one sex over another. You know, whether it's, you know, returning women to some sort of notional state of subservience. Actually, I would contest the idea that it's universally the case in all times and all civilizations apart from our own that women have been subservient. And I think that when you look at the texture of ordinary life. You know, you look at historical writing, you know, the texture of ordinary life as it sort of pops up in writings throughout the ages. It's far from obvious that women actually are. You know, yes, there are plenty of things that you can point at, but then you look at a character like the wife of Bath in Chaucer.
Okay, like, wow, are you reading my mind? So, as chance would have it, I read your NatCon 2 speech while I was teaching the Canterbury Tales. Okay. And so, you know, because I have to just read a selection, we read the general prologue, we read the Knight's Tale, we read the Miller's Tale, we read the Wife of Bath's Tale. So, you know, and they're all about what you keep getting at in your writing, which is how are we going to kind of live together? Like, and fascinatingly enough, of course, the Canterbury Tales is coming right out of all of the social upheaval, in the wake of in the wake of the Black Death, and everything is being renegotiated. And I challenge anyone to read the Canterbury Tales, and it's I don't know it. Our heritage is much more complicated than these sort of simplified and silly heuristics would suggest. And, the wife of Bath just like, bursts out of this piece in such a way that challenges so many, I think, of the priors. And in fact, Mary, when I was reading your piece, I sort of think of the Knight's Tale as sort of a trad tale. I think of the Miller's Tale as a kind of cad tale, and I read the Wife of Bath's tale as a RadFem tale because it's about
totally
power.
Be a TERF.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Yeah. Totally. Right.
She'd 100% be a TERF.
Totally.
She wouldn't care. She doesn't care what anyone thinks of her.
Right. And you really see that not so much in her tale, but in her prologue, in which the whole thing is really. Yeah, fine. You men folk and you sort of talk about power and influence. Let me tell you, what's really going on here. Anyway, Guy, I can't believe I'm just excited. You just made my day, Mary. that you anticipated my Chaucer question.
Do you need me to depart? I mean,
yeah, because I could talk about this all day. I could talk about this all day. I love this.
I first you first startled me, Mary, when I read your essay about how America had succumbed to Satanism, and I thought it was very provocative because you're not talking about literal Satanism, at least I don't think you are, but you were talking about Satan as an icon of the completely unencumbered, willful, choosing individual. Yeah. And your argument is that America and presumably the West, the capitalist West, has succumbed to where this sort of Satan is our unacknowledged idol. And what struck me about that was, as you know, I've published a book in the last year or so about the possible coming of totalitarianism to the West. And one of the things I learned about the Bolshevik Revolution is that in the decade before the Bolsheviks took power, Satan had become a literary figure, an idol, a poster boy for the intellectual and cultural elites in Russia, not because they believed in Satan, but because they admired him as a big R romantic figure of the willful, choosing, self-made individual. Could you share for our listeners your argument there?
So I did, originally when I filed that, I sent a note to my editor saying, if I make this any longer, it's going to turn into an argument about how America is how Satanism is now the established religion of America. And I had, but I don't really want to do that because it seems like a bit much. And she was like, no, the ending's really boring at the moment. You've got to put that bit in. The argument I wanted to make starts. Well, it's difficult to summarize, but really I'm drawing an intellectual genealogy from the Satan in Milton, which comes out of the Puritan desire to escape the strictures, to escape the top-down authoritarian strictures of the Catholic Church for a more intimate and more personal relation with God. I mean, again, I'm being horribly reductive here, but that sense of wanting to break free of church authority is very much present in Milton's Paradise Lost, and I think Milton really wrestles with, in his depiction of Satan, both with the temptation to take that will to separateness to its extreme, and then also with the limitations of that approach. If you can allow me to digress for a moment, one of the nicest responses I had to that essay was a very thoughtful one by Sam Bunce, who writes at Athwart magazine, who took me to task for not doing justice to Milton, who in simply saying that simply quoting William Blake, who said Milton was of the devil's party and didn't realize it. That was William Blake's take on Milton.
I share that. I think that has really altered the way that we receive Milton Satan
Very much so, very much so.
Yeah.
And Sam dug into Milton's Satan a bit more and pointed out that, in fact, what's interesting about him is that he starts out very appealing and he becomes more boring as the poem goes on.
He degenerates into
this sort of self-absorbed, dull, static. He runs out of resources of selfhood to draw on. And in that sense, it's a very insightful picture of what happens if you try and become a wholly self-created person.
Yeah, in fact, his rage Satan's rage is that he loses his ability to claim he created himself. In other words, he pitches to the were you there? Did anybody else see God, this God thing create us? Not so much. Like, I don't buy it. So he's obsessed with self-creation, which, again, think about this, Mary, in terms of our moment, this sort of creation of our avatars in the online space, in the meat space. I mean,
yes,
absolutely, I think this is exactly the nexus of what's going on culturally.
And it's also why art is so dull at the moment, which is something the weird online right talks about a lot.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I started with Paradise Lost and the Puritans, and then I wove that together with this sort of dream of self-creation, which stays alive in thinker after thinker, and you can trace it down through some of the romantics in the 18th and 19th century, all the way to where it pops up again in the early 20th century in the works of Aleister Crowley, who actually did present himself as a Satanist, whose works were then adopted by an American. I get confused which one is the Satanic Temple and which one is the Temple of Satan, but anyway, there are two, and they really hate each other. They're like Spurs and Arsenal.
Rival Protestant sects.
Yeah, kind of. One of them, and I forget which one, but one of them is really into all of the iconography, the sort of heavy metal aesthetic, and the other one is really just very, very liberal. They're sort of, it's sort of libertarianism, libertarianism but just a little bit more,
Our libertarianism turned to 11.
Right, exactly. Libertarianism dialed up to 11, and those, and I think that's the. I can't remember which one it is, but one of them is now leading a campaign to roll back the changes to abortion law in Texas on the basis of religious freedom, because it would impede their ability to conduct a religious ritual surrounding an actual abortion procedure.
Which is like all the fever dreams of like the radical anti-abortionist types, right? I mean,
it is. It's absolutely all of that. So, I mean, it's either an extraordinarily adept piece of trolling, or I'm not completely sure what it is, in this day and age.
But I think what they're doing, though, is showing the limits of liberalism itself. That a liberalism that's not founded on some shared sense of transcendent and absolute values ultimately becomes unworkable. I mean, I think that it's brilliant trolling, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I wove that together with some quotes from various assorted self-help books, and bits and pieces from Aleister Crowley, who's central.
Who said you should run a thing like who said which thinker said this, and
which thinker. I mean, every man and woman is a star is a quote from Aleister Crowley's Book of the Law, and I mean and that's pretty much the sort of central contention, not just of most self-help books, but also you could argue of most of the works of Disney.
Yeah,
that's so true.
Look, it's so interesting you say that. You remind me of a young man who came to our Eastern Orthodox parish briefly before he moved out of town. He was getting out of a Crowley cult. They have a chapter of the OTO here in my town. And he told me once after in coffee hour, we were talking, and he said, I was in this thing for a few years. And when you read Crowley, as we all did, liturgically, said you realize that the sort of things that he was advocating in the 20s and the 30s, they have been realized. He said Crowley controls Hollywood and nobody knows it. I mean, he wasn't talking about a secret conspiracy theory. He was talking about how the themes of radical self-invention and sexual liberation that Crowley espoused when he was radical, considered the horrible beast, they are now wholly mainstream.
Right, it's entirely normalized, and so it's not. I suppose the way I put it is, but when you realize that Satanists are really just libertarians, you think, oh well, that's not very interesting, and then you think, wait, how many libertarians? How many Satanists?
Yeah,
right. Well, Yeah, you talk about this. You're again, I think you coined this, so I'm going to give you credit. Why not? You could correct me if I'm wrong, but this notion of bio-libertarianism, I think I have found this pretty helpful for me as I try to make sense out of things as I see on Twitter and the online spaces. And if you could sort of maybe explain a little bit what you mean by bio-libertarianism and why it is perhaps so seductive.
Right. So what I'm trying to argue there, I developed this a little bit in my talk in Florida. If my central contention is that relations between the sexes always have a basis in material, in the material, and that we still underestimate the material shift in relations between the sexes that took place with the invention and widespread adoption of contraception.
Right.
And others far better informed than me have argued that it was pretty much an ineluctable path from the normalization of contraception through the collapse of previously quite disciplined sexual mores, because you no longer had to be continent in order to avoid pregnancy as a woman. It was suddenly possible with 99% efficacy to have sex outside marriage.
Right.
However, but the one you got to do something about the 1%, right?
So therefore,
and so at that point, you're ineluctably on a path to legalizing abortion, and because it's very difficult to avoid the compassionate case for it. Once that many women are in that position, then what else are you going to do? So we find ourselves where we are today. But what I also argue is that radically reframed what feminism is for, and what feminism is seeking to achieve. Because at the point in the 1960s where women were campaigning for abortion, they were doing so on the basis that it was necessary in order to enter the market on the same terms as men for us to be able to eliminate all of those things which put us at a disadvantage relative to men in the workplace, and that includes pregnancy,
equity.
Equity, exactly.
Yeah.
So you can then trace a path from contraception through abortion to absolute parity in the workplace, and that becoming the definitive marker of personhood for women.
Even President Biden just the other day, I think, tweeted something out like, X amount of women have been barred from the workplace, and it's like, what a fascinating inversion of sort of, I think, cuts to the very core of the question of what we are for just as human beings. I don't think we have an answer to that question, not in any kind of mainstream way.
And just bringing it back to bio-libertarianism for a moment. If you take all of this together, my argument is that feminism, in the pre-contraception and pre-abortion sense, focused on seeking an equitable settlement between men and women that recognized sex differences which were seen as intractable, because there was no medical means of superseding them. And then suddenly there was a medical means of superseding them. And so suddenly it becomes imaginable, it becomes thinkable that we might have a personhood which entirely transcends our physiology at the level of sex dimorphism. And at that point, feminism becomes about transcending, not just about an equitable settlement between the sexes, but about transcending our sexually dimorphic biology.
And the category itself, right?
Yeah, and the category, exactly. And at that point, it stops being about liberation from certain forms of political disadvantage, or mitigation of certain forms of political or material disadvantage based on sex dimorphism, and becomes about liberation from our bodies themselves. I call it bio-libertarianism rather than sex libertarianism, as my friend Erica Bakioki does, because I want to extend that idea beyond just the realm of sex dimorphism, which in my view is a wedge issue for something much greater and much more frankly alarming, which is really about the liberation of humans from all of the constraints of our bodies, which takes us into domains such as digital augmentation of human physiology, and then the the terrain of cyborg feminism and transhumanism and genetic alteration of children, and the experimental hybrid chimeric creatures that are neither human nor animal, growing human organs inside animal hosts. There's a whole territory there which is potentially immensely lucrative for the firms pursuing it, but it cuts fundamentally at the knees of what we are as humans.
Rod, jump in.
Yeah, Michael Hanby, this philosopher of science at Catholic U in America, has a great formulation. He says the sexual revolution is the technological revolution applied to the human body. And I think that's a brilliant insight, because we go back to think about Bacon and how his whole push for science was to give humanity power over the natural world.
Yeah, and Descartes, master and commander over the material universe. Yeah,
exactly. And so you end up, one of the novels I read last year that really knocked me flat was Paul Kingsnorth's novel Alexandria, with this dystopian novel set in the far future, where people are invited to solve all their problems of suffering in the body and struggling in the body by just uploading their consciousness to the cloud. I mean, in the best science fiction and fantasy they're really writing about today, that's exactly what Kingsnorth is talking about, trying to attack this very idea, this satanic promise that we can be as gods.
Yeah, I think that's right. And bio-libertarianism, once you see it, a little bit like, my flip phrase, meet Lego. This idea that we are the human self is somehow separable from the body, which is absurd when you think about it. I mean, I joke sometimes that, there are downsides to being female, but one of the upsides to being female is that if you get PMS, Cartesian dualism just seems like a ridiculous idea.
Right. I mean, it's like reality happens, right? And we confront reality, and technology certainly allows us to avoid unpleasant aspects of reality. I mean, Rod and I joke regularly about living in Louisiana during the summer, and the technology of air conditioning makes an uninhabitable place habitable. Up here in New England, it gets really dang cold, and having the technologies to heat the house and all of that is really, really fantastic. And so I get that we interact and adapt to reality, but I'm always shocked by the way in which this, when you sort of, again, you're going out with this bio-libertarianism, is that, well, what are the limits here? What exactly, what if my problem is, my body? And we're seeing this playing out on a massive scale right now. And I know all of us will be canceled and called TERFs and all that nice stuff, which is fine. But, I see this being played out on the bodies of 12-year-olds right now in front of us. And it's shocking. It's shocking to me that it's not shocking.
Yeah, I think particularly the 1,000%, I believe it is, on average, increase in the number of young women, adolescent girls, who now wish to identify as boys, should tell us something about what it's like growing up as a girl.
It's 4,000% in UK. 4,000%.
It's gobsmacking.
Okay, so Mary, so just yesterday you tweeted out this query, this question. I do. Mind blowing, right? And can you just set this up for us, because you put out a piece this morning that I read. Sort of, I don't know what was the genesis of this whole thing. If you could just explain to the audience what happened.
Sure. So I was writing a piece yesterday about the grooming gangs in the United Kingdom. Now, for anybody who doesn't follow British news, this is a phenomenon which has been a scandal, an endemic scandal over the last few years in the UK. In which in provincial towns throughout the UK, young girls, normally from care homes and working class, impoverished, difficult backgrounds.
Is a care home like like a foster home? Okay.
Foster kids, runaways, kids from broken homes, like young girls, very young, some of them primary, some of them like 11, 12 years old, are being groomed and then sold into the sex industry. And it blew up as a scandal because of the ethnic background of the majority of the men who were doing this, many of whom came from South Asian and often, although not exclusively, Muslim heritage. Right. And there was some suggestion that the whole issue had been routinely covered up for a number of years because nobody wanted to incite a race war.
Right.
So it when it did blow up, then of course it did incite a race war.
Of course.
So the article I wrote yesterday, because it's all back in the news again because there's been new testimony and another case has collapsed and so on and so forth, about how, yes, there is a racialized element to this, but there's also an aspect to it which is straightforwardly about the interaction between the desires of a subset of men for the sexual lust of a subset of men for very young girls, and how that interacts with a liberal sexual culture in which it's the only distinction we're able to make between somebody being violently screwed whilst being choked and spat at and it being abuse, and the same thing happening and it being erotic is whether or not the girl in question consented, which makes it extremely difficult to prosecute those cases.
Of course. And that whole the consent thing is so flimsy. It's not something.
It's not enough.
You cannot ground a civilization in consent. It's untenable, and it's shocking.
It's untenable, and it's particularly untenable when you think about the disjunction between a predatory adult man and on average pretty innocent young girl. And while I was researching this piece yesterday, I tweeted. I expected maybe 20-30 responses. I tweeted to my Twitter followers, what's the first time to women, what's the first time you remember being approached in a sexual way by an adult man? And I thought for me it's probably somewhere around 12. And I was expecting maybe 20-30 replies. So far there's over 1,500 and counting, and some of them are just horrifying,
harrowing,
absolutely harrowing.
I spent an hour last night. I was I was in I'm sure I'm not alone here in a very, very, very dark place. I checked this morning, it was over 1,500 responses, really horrifying stuff. And okay, so I again, just picking up, the case I wanted to make is that yes, there's a racialized dimension to the grooming gangs in the United Kingdom, deeper.
And but it goes way deeper than that.
Right.
I mean, you only have to look at the testimony, the reported in the Ghislaine Maxwell trial that came out this morning, and there was the account of this girl, what happened to her in the 1990s, in a context, where the socioeconomic background of everybody involved was quite different to the girls who was victimized in provincial British towns, but the parallels are eerie. This girl was groomed very methodically, and then she was sexually abused for years, whilst barely adolescent. So this is so really And the conclusion that I wanted to draw from this is that straightforwardly, consent is not enough, and sexual liberalism has casualties, and those casualties will be the girls that we don't want to think about. It'll be the fatherless ones, the lonely ones, the ones who are already coming from violent homes. It'll be the girls in foster homes. It'll be the ones that we can cast to one side as acceptable casualties, and that just makes me so boilingly angry. That's right. It's so grotesquely unjust. Everybody else is because we want to keep our sexual freedoms, and we don't want to have our personal gratification constrained by modesty or a general social expectation of continence. We're willing to sacrifice those girls on that altar. That's right. And I think that's just monstrous. It's disgusting. So I go in two ways in my head, right? So it's there's a cultural element to this, and I think that there is a kind of biological element to this, right? That I think we have to contend with. As far as the biological is concerned, I do think that this is one of those dark places of our animal natures that we do very much need to contend with. That there is something predatorial about that clusters in the male of a species. Like there is something, there's a darkness there, right? The desire to dominate, et cetera, which is, again, dark but interesting. Secondly, there's this sort of the cultural phenomena, of look, how in the hell are we allowing this to happen? And so in my head this morning, I'm going back, if Mary could, if we could go back, 300 years ago and send out that same tweet, like what would the response have been any different? I don't know. I wish I had data on that. You know what I mean? Like it matters to me because I've been obsessed. I've been obsessed as of late. I'm a Gen Xer,
And several episodes back, Rod and I were talking about movies that we liked, and we were talking about this Cameron Crowe movie called Almost Famous. And Rod made the point, like, Kale, like, I tried to watch it with my kids the other day, and I was just sort of blown away by the fact that these girls are like 13 and 14 years old.
Groupies, rock star groupies.
The groupies, right, in the movie. And I'm like, that's right. And one of the jokes in there's a scene, they're on the tour bus, and they're riding in some sort of country dirt road, and there's a girls cross country team running across, and like one of the, I think it's the drummer's like, high school girls, and like is, gets all excited. Sort of, it's just this sort of joke, right? And then I started thinking, like, when did we think it was okay for adult males to prey upon prepubescent and pubescent girls? Like, I don't understand this. Like, this was a joke 20 years ago.
Yeah, well, this is, and the film itself is set in the 70s among rock stars, and
right.
Yeah, this was completely common back then, and this is why it's really strange that some of these aged rockers are now caught up in the Me Too thing, because when they were young men, this was considered c'est la vie. So maybe there is progress, Kale.
Yeah. Well, right. The reason why I asked this is, like, where, I mean, look, I'm a dad. And I know people hate when somebody like me starts off the conversation with, I'm a dad with daughters and da-da-da. But it's like, really, look, where are the men, who are willing to be a knight here, and protect the weak and the innocent? Like, where are they?
It's one of the things that I hear from more from the angry online right. So if anybody from the angry online right is listening to this and I mischaracterize your position, forgive me. But it's my understanding of the counter argument you'd get to that is that actually the feminists all said, we don't want your chivalry anymore. So now you don't have it anymore. So you made your bed, ladies. Now your daughters can lie in it and get raped.
Wow.
I'm being mindful of the time here. We're about,
Mary's
kids are coming home from school. But I just want to ask you, Mary, you said, as I recall, your take on the National Conservatism Conference was that a lot of people there know what they're against, but they don't know what they're for. Can you briefly unpack that?
I think what I was getting at is, well, there's a number of sort of intersecting tectonic plates there, and again, forgive me, my august listenership here, if I've just got the wrong end of the stick on American politics, because I'm just not that informed of it. I'm not that up on the kind of granular state of conservative infighting, but my sense of, there were a number of different factions at the National Conservatism Conference. There were the Catholic traditionalists. There were some sort of, conservatives who've been mugged by reality. There were some liberal anti-wokeists. There were, and then there was an interesting, much younger faction, which probably needs to be broken down more, which I characterized as Conservatism Inc. with a K, as in they have tattoos and they get up at 6 to lift. Right.
The Jack Murphy, the Jack Murphy strain.
He was there. He was there.
Yeah. I like Jack. I mean,
the meme that, like, the sort of meme riddled, very online guys who communicate as much in frog memes as the sort of they're as conversant with frog memes as they are with the founding fathers. That's right. And that's quite a different culture. And my sense was that there were some sort of top level disputes going on as to whether there were any shared values that could be united around other than an opposition to wokeism, and that was one argument that was going on. But my sense of what's coming down the pipeline is a much more profound fracture between the very online emerging youthful conservatives who have really quite a different perspective, and all of us sort of, and I probably include myself in this, I'm 42, and all of the older people who are still arguing about whether or not liberalism is even possible, whereas the young guys are just like, it's a busted flush,
right?
And just take that as a sort of foundational premise, and they're arguing about what comes next.
Wow. Well, yeah, I think that's definitely true as someone who participates in these arguments, because they do seem so insular in a way, and we don't know what we're for. I hope we can figure it out. I mean, it's enough. It may be enough to win elections to be against wokeness. I would be happy to have someone who is effectively against wokeness, but that's not the same thing as saying what we're for. Larry, if we still have time, could you give me a little précis of what you're for?
Yeah.
What are the core values that animate you?
The hill I will die on is defending the human. You know, I mean, I could spend another very enjoyable hour discussing with you guys what I mean by the human. But very briefly, I set that against this sort of emerging biosurveillance state that treats us all as meat with a detachable, entirely insubstantial identity, which we can craft to suit ourselves and which we carry around in sort of remodelable meat avatars. You know, that world is not one I want to live in, and I'll die fighting it.
Yeah.
Marvelous.
The real, indeed. Amen. Yeah. All right. Well, look, Mary, I got to tell you, look, I'm super excited to have had this opportunity to have you on the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, audience, I can't recommend Mary's writing highly enough. It's just really fantastic. She's got a great ability to coin phrases, but also to sort of frame things. I think you have this sort of ability to sort of put some patterns together that are a little bit counterintuitive and sort of out of the ruts that a lot of us run in. And so I just thank you for helping me see things differently or something like that. So,
and where, Mary, can our listeners find you online?
Most of my writing is at Unherd, www.unherd.com, where I'm a contributing editor.
H-E-R-D, U-N-H-E-R-D.
U-N-H-E-R-D. And I have a Substack at reactionary-feminism.com, reactionary feminist with a T. That's my website, Reactionary Feminist. You Google that, you'll find me. Right. Thank you so much for having me, you guys. It's been such a pleasure.
Indeed. Rod, why don't you send us off, brother?
Don't get nothing on you.
All right, take care.